All right, so welcome back to for part two. So once the Opium Wars took place between Britain and China, Japan began to really galvanize itself, you might say, with regard to understanding the conditions that were beginning to um, come about in the Far East, the increasing amount of attention that that region of the world was attracting um, on the part of Western powers and Western authorities. So this marked a potential challenge of Tokugawa's existing foreign policy, this idea of isolation and isolationism. British ascension in the Pacific was perceived as a direct, almost existential threat to Japan itself. This was even more confirmed when, in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry, a U.S. Uh, Commodore that was in charge of several frigates of the U.S. Navy, was sent on a mission to the capital city of Tokugawa, Japan, in Edo, to open up official relations with Japan between Japan and the United States. The key interests here on the part of Perry was the protection of shipwrecked American sailors should they make their way to the islands of Japan, that they would not be, kind of mistreated before U.S. Ships or representatives could rescue them or you get them back. They also, the British, or excuse me, the American interests also wanted to acquire coaling stations for the increasingly coal-fueled military vessels of the U.S. Navy. The U.S. wanted the right to take on provisions in Japanese ports, and they also wanted to open up trade between the United States and Japan itself. And lastly, they also wanted to assert a strategic influence in the Pacific. Um, Having consolidated control over the Oregon and California territories in the 1840s, this meant that the United States was having a presence in the Pacific, and therefore the U.S. wanted to begin not only to project its power, but then open up the various countries in and along the Pacific Rim and throughout the Pacific Ocean itself. Japan was a natural kind of consideration in that. So Commodore Perry allowed for a 1 year period to give the Japanese authorities time to decide on a course of action for themselves. Uh, and this event really kind of began to bring uh, impose a certain amount of reality on the Tokugawa regime and those that were in power at the time. And there was a good deal of debate that was taking place within the Tokugawa system, leading to some pretty divisive um, discussions or the development of various schools of thought. We'll go over those now. The first of these, or one of these, was Kaikuku, or what's known or translates as open country. These were Japanese officials and a segment of the Japanese population that readily identified with the Dutch scholars' view that Western technology was well advanced and eclipsed Japanese capabilities at the time. And so as a result, those that bought into this idea of kaikuku saw the need for Western weapons, the adaptation, or excuse me, the adoption and adaptation of Western technology in order to use that to protect Japan itself. So this is a very kind of realist perspective. That they had a very kind of honest opinion of where Japan's capabilities lay with regard to the rest of the international community, and that in many cases Japan was behind on several kind of key benchmarks. One individual who was a champion of this idea of one open country or kaikuku was Sakama Shozen, an influential samurai scholar. He sought a combination of Eastern Confucianism fused with Western pragmatism in order to define Japan's identity. Um, so it really is kind of a hybrid here, you might say, of um, uh, to reinvent or overhaul Japanese philosophy, but Japanese kind of sense of self in many respects. Shozan was an admirer of Russia's Peter the Great, who had a Western focus about his, approach to authority, and also one who was heavily steeped in meritocracy and having people in positions of authority that knew what they were doing and had the merits to govern wisely. As an antithesis to the Kaikoku school of thought, you have the Joi school of thought, which roughly translates as expel the barbarians. Members of this group or faction were xenophobic, that they feared Western incursions, Western interference. They saw China's defeat in the Opium Wars being the result of the contamination of China by Western religion and culture. And so this was almost a doubling down on the isolationist kind of principles that were in existence in place within the Tokugawa system. They exhibited a zealous commitment to Japan's imperial order. They bought into this idea of a mystical embodiment of the Japanese nation itself, between its leadership and the people. Um, some of these uh, leading kind of inner vanguard that was leading this charge of xenophobia included the Mito scholars, such as Azawa Seishisai, who believed that the Western threat was ideological and not technological. That in many cases, the Joey faction uh, believed that Christianity was a form of indoctrination designed to subordinate or subjugate those to Western colonization and colonialism. And so as a result, the Joey offered up an alternative perspective known as Kokutai or emperor system. This was the installation of really what can best be described as a Japanese state religion, creating this, again, kind of mystical bond between the common people and the struggles of the nation itself. How did this all play itself out? Well, in the short run, there's a short term and a long term um, dynamic here. In the short term, Japan realized that it was in no position to contest any type of ultimatums that were delivered by the likes of Commodore Perry or anyone else. And so, as a result, in 1858, Japan agreed to what's known as the Harris Treaty. This is named after Townsend Harris, the first American consul to Japan. And Japan was forced to, in essence, agree to open Edo, Kobe, Nagasaki, Nagita, and Yokohama harbors to U.S. trade. There was also the term of the treaty that placed Japanese tariffs under international control, much as was the experience in China, and also the fixing of import duties at low levels to benefit Western goods coming into, flooding into, in this case, Japan. That's again set the standard for other Western powers to achieve their own unequal treaties with Japan. And so, as a result, various unequal treaties were ratified with Japan, with Britain, France, Holland, and Russia as well. Within a matter of weeks following the Harris Treaty, all of these other countries had begun the process or actually concluded these unequal treaties with Japan. So it seemed from the outset here that Japan was destined for the same fate as China. But the key pivot here for Japan and Japanese history was indeed the Meiji Restoration, which helped to reverse Japan's fortunes. There were a number of culminating factors that led to the Meiji Restoration. First and foremost, there was a strong nationalist sentiment brewing within Japan itself. That the Tokugawa Bakufu, the kind of main organizing centralized authority in Japan, had allowed local daimyo to offer input on developments in foreign affairs to kind of open up at least the discussion of and the airing of grievances, you might say, within and across the Japanese political system. What's interesting, though, is that when the Bakufu decides to do this, uh, the daimyo, the kind of provincial governors, take that as a sign of weakness, and so as a result, many of these daimyo who already resented foreign interference, but realized at the same time Japan's uh, predicament and the need for buying time in order to strengthen the Japanese nation itself to protect itself, um, they took pretty drastic measures, including the assassination of Tokugawa leadership, which allowed for provincial leaders to consolidate power around a new centralized authority, the Japanese emperor himself. In January of 1868, this is going to result in Emperor Mutsuhito, uh, the Meiji Emperor, to replace the Tokugawa order. In essence, this was a coup d'etat. As one Japanese scholar put it, this was the displacement of one feudal order by another. Um, a change in the name of old values, not in the installation of new ones. And therefore, this was not really a revolution, as we saw in the American Revolution or even the French Revolution, where there's an installation or an attempt to become independent or to install a new system of government. That was not the case here in Japan. So that's really why this is a restoration, a pivot from uh, uh, the shogun, the Bakufu, being kind of this warlord over Japan, to now recognizing and placing governing authority most directly in the hands of the Japanese emperor himself. This was championed by not only a large cross section of the authorities within Japan, the daimyo, but it was also heavily supported by the disillusioned samurai class itself. So government became more centralized. The under the imperial system of Japan, the government controlled the economy. They established a universal education system. They began to um, adopt methods and kind of practices of Western science. They constructed a merchant marine, a Japanese merchant marine for themselves, so that the Japanese nation had a presence on uh, you know, engaging in trade with other parts of the world and beginning to benefit from that and profit from that. Um, they also wanted to use that merchant marine in order to, of course, conduct foreign trade. And they wanted to also provide for, or at least catch up as quickly as possible with establishing a modernized military national defense force. So this was the agenda basically for Japan in the closing decades of the 19th century, from 1868 to 1890. Meiji leadership, pursued these interests um, with a high degree of intensity. And again, by and large, it was successful. Japan began to industrialize, and there was a certain flexibility of thought, a shift away from xenophobia to more xenophilia, kind of almost an aberration or adulation of Western culture and Western technology and science. But always the end result, the ultimate goal here was to take advantage of Western concepts and apply them to enhance the independence and the sovereignty of Japan itself. So again, a very this is key to understand because it gives us it's the pivot where Japan's fate and China's fate diverge. Interestingly, also, this leadership emerging within this new imperial regime um, was young. They were active. They were, uh, ambitious. In 1868, the average age of this cadre of leadership acting in the emperor's interests or name was just over 30 years old. So it was a very, very young in the mindset or kind of in the context of politics, a very young demographic group here. And they began to borrow heavily from a variety of different European experiences and also kinds of policies and um, uh, bureaucracy. For example, from Britain, Japan organized its navy, its telegraph system, its postal system. From France, Japan organized its army, its primary school system, local law enforcement, and also judicial system. From the United States, Japan took to um, uh, copying the primary school system, the national bank system, and the Sapporo Agricultural College. These were all kind of based on US models. Later on, by 1878, Japan pivoted from modeling its army on the French uh, military, to the German military. Again, Germany having created the Second Reich in 1871, having defeated the French forces in that year. Japan witnessed all this and realized, hey, let's go with this new industrializing strongman of Europe, Germany, and begin to model our fighting forces off of it, specifically the army. From Belgium, Japan modeled its Bank of Japan on the financial kind of system of Belgium. And all of this was due in part, or in large part, to what's known as the Iwakura mission, which lasted from 1871 to 1873, as you can see on the slide. This is named for Prince Iwakura Totomi, the most prominent member of the mission himself. You can see him in this image, seated center with his surrounding delegates, or his inner circle, you might say. This was, again, a delegation of the most prominent members. They were comprised of several individuals, all of which were, kind of tasked with going off in their world tour here, lasting again 2 years, to investigate all of these different types of bureaucracy in order to modernize Japan as quickly as possible. So this was a 2-year sojourn to study all these various aspects of Western life and identity and governing and so on. And they published their findings when they returned, and also with their findings, the recommendations. It was a 2,000-page report spanning some 5 volumes, and it formed the basis for how Japan was going to close the gap with Western powers. So again, this wasn't something that was haphazard within the Meiji state. I mean, this was very methodical as far as how they were going to catch up, and it was very potent as well. Japanese society sought to realign the family along the lines of independent nuclear family units. So this would allow, they believed, greater opportunities for women, but in reality, again, this fell short of expectations. And interestingly, this proved to be a sticking point for conservative Meiji leaders. That they wanted to modernize, but they didn't necessarily. They wanted to retain a certain amount of their own identity as Japanese, as nationalists. So they're looking for more of the technological um, and industrial types of takeaways, and not so much the cultural ones. By 1889, you have the installation of the Meiji Constitution, which was presented as a gift from the emperor to his people. This was not a democratic manifestation. That is to say, that this was not something that you know delegates, representatives from the people, gathered in a central, kind of uh, uh, convention and then decided on what the terms of the constitution would be. Instead, again, this was coming from the emperor, from his inner circle of advisors, and being imposed on the people in many respects. The terms of the constitution included the following: the emperor held all executive authority. The ministers under his dominion were responsible to the emperor. They were not responsible to the people. The supreme command of the army and navy fell under the emperor's authority. And also, the emperor could suspend the diet, basically the legislative entity or body, um, which was bicameral in its orientation. That means that it had two houses to it, two chambers. So, again, here the takeaway is that the emperor held an overwhelming majority of political power for the state, for the country of Japan itself. And very quickly, this is becomes the basis for Japan beginning to reinvent itself and pivot towards being an imperial power itself. We talked earlier about the Sino-Japanese War towards the closing years of the 19th century. Again, this is an early demonstration of the highly competitive, imperialized world during that period of time. Every major world power had managed to succeed at synthesizing nationalism and imperialism. Even the United States had managed to do that, and so Japan was following in the footsteps of, the standard of the time. For much of the 20th century, this would be determined, of course, by the spiraling amount of conflict in the first half of the 20th century. One of the best examples of this, almost at the outset of the 20th century, was in what was known as the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. This served as the second major surprise for Western imperial powers and for the United States as well. Um, this was resulted in a swift rout of Russian forces by the Japanese, both on land and at sea. The Russian powers were, excuse me, the Western powers were stunned by just how quickly Russian forces were utterly routed and destroyed. There's also a racial context to all of this. That in many cases, these more conservative Western imperial powers, operating really from a mindset, you might say, of social Darwinism, this idea of racial hierarchy, they believed that Japan was not capable of going toe to toe with a European power, as they kind of began to view Russia to be. Um, uh, that there was Japan's victory here was not according to that model, supposed to happen in many respects. So when Japan not only wins the war, but wins it in such a decisive fashion, I mean, utterly wrecking the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, which you can see just off the coast of uh, Korea here, and also victories in Manchuria as well against Russian forces. This is a Russian humiliation. And so as a result, Japan, or excuse me, Britain and the United States in particular, the two kind of major world powers that had a vested interest in the Pacific, saw a need to keep Japanese power in check, particularly Japanese naval power, which would lead to the convention in uh, New Hampshire, hosted by Theodore Roosevelt, in which Japan, Britain, and the United States would agree to a tiered system as far as the tonnage of naval warships that these three powers could put to sea, to basically manage an arms race, a naval arms race in the Pacific. The humiliation that the Russians endured and suffered as a result of this war also contributed to growing resentment and domestic unrest within the Russian state itself. There was almost immediately on the heels of news of this utter catastrophe in the Russo-Japanese War, um, citizens within St. Petersburg rise up against the established czarist state. Now, that revolution of 1905 would result in failure, but it would radicalize future generations of Russians that would persist and almost acts as a dress rehearsal, you might say, for the later Russian Revolution of 1917 that we'll talk about next week when we turn attention to World War One. For now, let me just check the time here. We're running out. Okay, I'm gonna pause things here. We'll turn attention when we come back to part three, with regard to developments in India. So stay tuned.